Well, it's the same old story. You have a daughter that's living with her mother who has recently become a single mother, not by choice. Single mother is working 3 part-time jobs to try to keep up with all of her bills and paying rent and all of that. The daughter is still at school, trying to go every day in the midst of her peers, hiding the pain, hiding the fact that she is grieved at how poorly she and her mother seem to get along. They don't seem to be on the same page when they're communicating with one another, and there are often disagreements, and there's conflict about what the rules are in the house and how she needs to be obeying those rules, and boy, there's conflict. In fact, there was so much conflict on one Friday afternoon. She was wanting to go out that evening, and well, the mother had different ideas. And there was this big fight, this big disagreement, and it turned into a bit of a shouting match. Well, at least on one side. Her mother was never really one to raise her voice. She was always very soft-spoken. She was never really one to yell. But she stood her ground. And the daughter had just lost her patience. She didn't like the rules being imposed on her. She thought that it was unfair. She didn't feel like she was being heard and listened to. And so she is so upset this one Friday afternoon. Well, she just packs up a bag and leaves the house. Her mother didn't know where she had gone. But she ran. She runs away. In reality, she wasn't really all that far. She didn't tell her mother where she had gone, only that she was fine and she was safe, but she didn't want to be there anymore. In reality, she wasn't far away. She was just at a friend's house. And it only took a couple of days being there until she started to really miss home. She missed hearing the voice of her mother, that soft voice that never really seemed to get angry even if she was. She missed being in a place where she could be comfortable. She missed being in a place where she belonged. She missed being in a place where she was wanted, even if she didn't really agree with the person living there. She missed home. She missed the comfortability of home, and she missed that sense of belonging. And it was that drew her back. She asked for a ride back to the house, and she starts going back to the house, sitting there in the passenger seat of the car, clenching her fists and shutting her jaw tight because she's afraid. She's scared. She had never run away like this. She had never really been defiant like this before. She may not have liked the rules that her mother had set, but she never really rebelled like that. And she also knew that she had never heard her mother really raise her voice in anger, yelling at her before. But she must be angry at this. So there she was, afraid. Finally, the car pulls into the driveway, and the mother, sitting there in the living room, worried, hears a car pull up in the driveway. She looks out the blinds. She sees who it is. She opens the door, and at the same time, the daughter is opening the door of the car, getting out, makes eye contact with the mother, like a deer in the headlights, afraid. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't know what she was going to say. And then she was shocked because the mother, to the daughter's surprise, just about laughs, opens her mouth wide in joy, opens her arms and starts running down the front stairs, running to her and embraces her. Daughter didn't know what to think at first, but decided to embrace it herself. And so she wraps her arms around the mother, and the mother just says, the first thing that she says, I'm glad you're home. I'm glad I'm home too. There's something that seems familiar about this story. It reminds me of something, or it reminds me of someone. Well, in John chapter 10, we have another one of those I am statements. Another one of these statements that reveals something about who God is and reveals something about what Jesus' mission was in the world. So turn to John chapter 10 if you haven't already. And I would like to read the first 10 verses, and then we'll stop there after the 10th verse. John chapter 10, starting in verse 1, hear the word of God. It says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." And so, here in this passage, we really get a snapshot of who Jesus is and who Jesus isn't. And in this, you have this large contrast between these thieves and these robbers, right? The thieves and the robbers, those are the bad ones. And then you have Jesus contrasting the thieves and the robbers. He says, "I am the door of the sheep." I'm the door of the sheep. So first, I want to focus in on what Jesus isn't. Jesus is not a thief or a robber. Of course, he's talking somewhat metaphorically here, right? He's talking about people who, again, in the image that Jesus laid out, they got in by another way. They didn't come in the right way to lead the sheep and to keep them safe, right? They came in amongst the sheep, and they're looking to do harm. They're looking to do harm. They're looking to serve themselves in some way. And Jesus is not that. He's not one who comes into the midst of the sheep to do harm. You have some unfit leaders out there, right? He talks about those who have come before me. Those who came before me, they've all been thieves and robbers. I don't know if you realize this, but there are other people who tried to lead the Jews before Jesus. They were trying to lead the Jews to, at least so they said, to safety, to redemption. They were trying to lead the sheep. But they never really ended up leading them into a place that really got them to redemption, like they really needed. So he says, those who come before me, they're like thieves and robbers. And look what he says about these unfit leaders, right? They come in the wrong way. In verse 1, they don't enter by the door. They come in by some other way. They're getting among the sheep by dishonorable means, right? Leaders that get to their position by fighting there and earning their place there, that's one thing. But these people, they just abuse the system in some way, right? They don't really have earned respect. They forced themselves into that position of leadership. That's not what a real leader looks like. And then later on in verse 5, it talks about how the sheep don't really know their voice, right? And don't flee from them. If the sheep don't know the voice of the shepherd or the person that's trying to lead them, they're not going to listen. there's a certain relationship that is implied, right? A certain relationship between the leader and those who were following the leader. And he says, others, they didn't know their voice. They don't know the voice of strangers. And then later on in verse 8, all who came before me are thieves and robbers. The sheep didn't listen to them. In the beginning of verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Right? Some leaders find themselves in positions. Maybe they force their way in there, but they're not really looking out for the well-being of the people they're leading. Their first concern is not the people, the first concern is themselves. Right? And the biggest thing here is that there is not a personal connection. There's not a personal connection. The thieves and the robbers, they do not care about the sheep that are around them. And then you have the portrait of Jesus, right? Jesus is not one of these thieves or robbers. Jesus, he says, he is the door of the sheep. And the reason that he paints that picture is that this is a pathway to safety. If you're talking about taking care of sheep, you would keep the sheep in a guarded area, right? But there's got to be a way for them to get into this guarded area, into this fenced-in area. They would go through a door, some sort of gate, right? Or there would be an opening and there would be a gatekeeper watching out to make sure that nothing got in or out of that gate, to make sure that the sheep were protected. And Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep. In other words, if you come through me, if you come to me, you will find safety. You will find security. You will find life. He says in verse 10, the thieves and the robbers, they came to steal and to kill and destroy. But I came that they might have, that the sheep might have life and have it abundantly. Right? So you have this vast contrast between the thieves and the robbers and Jesus, the door of the sheep. Because Jesus, he didn't come to do harm. He didn't come to bring division but communion. He didn't come to bring people earthly treasure but heavenly, eternal treasure. He didn't come to bring a sword but instead a cross. He didn't come to be served but to serve. And the biggest difference between these unfit leaders that Jesus talks about and himself is what? He cares about the sheep. There is a personal connection, right? I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. I care about my sheep. They know my voice. They will listen to my voice. And the biggest reason that the sheep are so willing to listen to him is because he's leading them to life. He's leading them to safety. You know a tree by its fruits, and you know a leader by where he's leading his people. And Jesus is trying to lead people to life. In fact, in verses 3 and 4, it talks about how the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them. And the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And we have to understand that Jesus is leading up to this point where eventually he will give his own life. Even in this section a little later, he says, a really good shepherd is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. That's exactly what he's willing to do. And that's exactly what he does. But again, the big point here is that he is trying to lead his people to life. He's not trying to do harm. He's not looking out for himself. He's not concerned about himself. If he was, by the way, Luke 3 would have looked very different. You remember what happened in Luke chapter 3? Jesus had been baptized, and he goes out into the wilderness, and Satan tries to tempt him with all of these, what I would say, are egotistical temptations. If you really do have the power that you say you do, why don't you just strike this rock and allow water to come out from it? Or sorry, turn the stone into bread. Thinking of a different passage. Why don't you just do that? It's not about me. If you really are the Son of God, why don't you just go to the pinnacle of the temple, throw yourself off, and allow God to catch you? He'll save you. He won't allow even one bit of you to be harmed, will he? You should not test the Lord your God. It's not about me. If you really want the power, why don't you just bow down to me? And then I will give you all of this as your dominion, as your domain. You can have the power. It's not all about me. Jesus' ministry from the very beginning, it was never about himself. And that's the way that Jesus distinguishes himself as a leader, by the way. Because more so than anybody else that I could ever think of, Jesus made his ministry about everybody else around him. And it was about himself last. That's why in the garden later on, right before he's arrested, he says, "Not my will, but your will be done." If I really have to do this, I will. I don't want to, but I will. Because Jesus' first concern and his priority was us. He cared about his sheep. There is that personal connection. Those under Jesus' care, they know that they are wanted and welcome. This fact is illustrated in Luke chapter 15. I'll go ahead and turn there and read to you this short parable. In Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 4. And again, the setting here is that Jesus is eating with people that other people don't think he should be eating with. He's eating with sinners, people who don't have everything figured out. And this is what he says after people complain about that. He says, "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.' Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." God cares about every single one of his sheep. And if there is one that is lost but is willing and knows that they want to come back, they need to come back, God will accept them with open arms. There is joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. So yes, no matter what your past is, no matter what clothes you're wearing, no matter what you've done and what you're involved in, God can drastically change your future. And you are wanted and welcome by Jesus. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done. As long as you are willing to come back. It's the same old story. I don't know, maybe you've heard this one before. There was a man. He had just barely become an adult. He had an older brother and he also had a father living with him in the same house. He didn't always get along with his father. He didn't always get along with his brother. And at some point or another, he decided that he had just had enough. He was impatient and he wanted out. He didn't want anything more to do with this household. And so he decides to take matters into his own hands. He goes before his father and he says, "Give me what is due to me. Go ahead and give me what you owe me. I want my share and I want to get out. I'm done." And so he takes his money and runs. He goes out and well, you know the way that the story goes. He squanders it. He uses the money on whatever he desires and soon is out. Completely out. And things only get worse when there's a famine and there's a shortage food. There's not much to go around. He himself didn't even have the money to afford it. And so he finds himself hired out to one of the local farms, working to feed the pigs. And he was so hungry and so wanting at one point that he looks at the pods that he's feeding the pigs and he says, I wish that I could just have one of those. And then he thinks back to memories of home. And he remembers the place where he belonged, even if he didn't always get along with everybody there. He remembered the place where he belonged, the place where he was wanted, the place where he was welcome. And he remembered that even the servants had plenty to eat. They had enough bread for their fill. But he was sitting there feeding pigs, wanting their food, with not even enough for himself. And so with these memories of home in his mind, he decides, I'm going to head back there. And so there he was, walking back to his home, clenching his hands, closing tight his jaw, afraid, scared. His father was never one to yell. His father was a rather soft-spoken man, but he had never really tested his limits like this before. He had never done something that would make him so angry before, but now that he has asked for his inheritance, squandered his inheritance, and is returning home, surely he'll be angry. So there he is, afraid, scared, walking closer towards home, and makes eye contact with the father. The father sees him off from a distance. And there he stood like a deer in the headlights, scared and afraid, not knowing what would happen next. He had come home expecting rejection, but instead what he found was a father who, almost laughing, opens up his mouth and with joy on his face, opens up his arms and starts running to the son. Running to the son, and the son had never seen him do this before. He ran to the son and then embraces him. And the first thing that he says, the only thing that he says is, glad you're home. And the son starts coming up with all of these apologies. I'm sorry, Father, I shouldn't have done that. If you would just be willing to take me back as one of your servants. And then the father says, prepare the fattened calf. We're going to have a feast. And then you go back to Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 6. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Joy in heaven. The whole heavenly host rejoicing together because one person has decided and has remembered that they need to go home. They need to go back to the place where they belong. They needed to go back to the place where they were wanted and where they were welcome. Jesus cares about all of his sheep. That includes each and every one of us. I know what a story sounds familiar, by the way. It reminds me of myself. It reminds me of each and every one of you. It reminds me of each of us. Because we all have this moment in our lives where at some point we realize that we're too far away from home and we really need to get back. We've gone too far away, and there's something about it that we miss. We miss being in the place where we belong. We miss being in the place where we are welcome. And most of all, we miss being wanted. Oh, everybody loves to be wanted. You don't want to be in a place where you feel unwanted or not needed. But Jesus has formed this church and is the head of the church in this place where everybody is truly wanted. Yes, you must be a sheep. And what I mean by that is, yes, you must be willing to obey the shepherd. You must be willing to listen. You must come with an attitude of submission and an attitude of, okay, what do I do next? Instead of, I already have all the right answers. Yes, you must be a sheep, but make no mistake. When that sheep returns back home, oh, there's going to be rejoicing in heaven. There's going to be a whole heavenly host singing together and rejoicing because this sheep has come home. So the question that I want to ask you is, are you too far from home? Maybe that's more of a distant memory for you, or maybe a recent memory. Maybe you reflect back on the time when you were far from home and you came back home and you were accepted and welcomed with open arms and embrace. You found the joy of redemption instead of in fear experiencing rejection. But maybe it's in your future. Maybe right now you're in a place where you are too far from home. And if you are, I want to encourage you to come back home. Come back home to a place where you are wanted, where you are welcome, and where you belong. Because that's the place that Jesus offers to every single one of us. This is only possible because of what Christ has done for us. We know that he gave his life for us. We know that he died on the cross. And now those who are baptized into his death, raised into new life, are freed from their sin. And because of that freedom, we can now dwell in the presence of God, and we can do so eternally. Because God gives us an eternal hope. Jesus is trying to lead you to an eternal hope. Allow him to lead you today. The first step in that is being willing to be baptized. And if you've already been baptized, continue to take those faithful steps until the very end. If you would like to respond to the invitation, we ask you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.
Softly and tender.